Okay, start. What's your name?
Kelly Fountain.
Kelly Fountain. Okay, and you have a son with autism?
Yep.
Okay, so this is him?
Yes.
That's him.
And what's your name, sir?
Colby Fountain.
Colby Fountain. Alright. Kelly, uh, can you tell us kind of what life was like uh, before Colby was diagnosed and leading up to his diagnosis?
Well, when Colby was little, he was, it's kind of difficult to describe. There were times when he was really happy, very energetic, but he seemed like he was in his own little world. He um, didn't really play with other kids. He seemed to play around them. He would run into objects on purpose and fall down. He fell on the floor quite a bit and would crawl on it, roll around on it. He wasn't coherent when he would talk. He would babble, and we couldn't understand what he was saying. He could make his needs known. He would point, and he would grunt, and when he wanted something, he would smile, and if he didn't want it, he'd shake his head no, or he'd nod his head yes. And he was very loving, very affectionate, but we noticed that there were times when he would squeeze really hard, almost to the point that it would hurt, or he would squeeze your hand really hard, almost to the point where it would hurt. And then there were other times when his grip was very weak. He didn't seem to be able to open things very easily. When you poured water over his head, he screamed as like he was being tortured. It was awful. He didn't like water on his face. He hated clothes. Just as soon as he walked in the door, the child stripped naked, everything except for his diaper. And hated socks and shoes. Those just drove him crazy. He was very fixated on one particular cartoon, one particular show, and he watched it over and over and over again. When he was in crowds or when there were a lot of people around, there was a lot of noise, he just totally shut down. Would not smile, would not look at you, would not talk, just like he had gone away, had left his body. There was no sparkle, there was no spark at all. Then there were other times when we were out, at Walmart or something, and he would go up to a total stranger and grab their hand and kiss it, and that terrified me because I was always afraid he would go off with just anybody. Bright lights scared him. Loud noises terrified him. He was afraid of trains. He was afraid of whistles, bells, buzzers. If someone came up from behind him and touched him, it scared him. Anybody touched his head, he couldn't stand that. He hated haircuts. Um, he seemed very impulsive, extremely impulsive. You never knew what he was going to do or when he was going to do it, and there was no rhyme or reason why he did many of the things he did. But he was very, very intelligent. It was really obvious that he was intelligent after being around him for a short period of time. I remember when people would first, teachers or speech therapists or any kind of therapists would first meet Colby, they would always assume he was mentally retarded. And I would always say, no, he's not. Just work with him a little bit and you'll see. And they would come back after about an hour and say, you're right, he's not. But I don't know what's going on. So he was obviously extremely intelligent, but he had so many different things going on at the same time that nobody could pinpoint what his disability was other than to tell us that he was severely delayed.
Okay. Um, so what led up to him getting diagnosed?
Well, that's what led up to him getting diagnosed. The more speech therapists and occupational therapists and physical therapists that worked with him, the more they came back and told us, we don't know what's going on with Colby. We know that he's highly intelligent. We know that he's capable of learning very quickly and retaining what he's learned. So it's obvious to us that he's not mentally retarded. There is something not right. And Colby had some things that none of us had ever seen before. You know, as a teacher, I thought I'd really met every type of child with any kind of disability that we knew about, but we'd never met anybody like Colby before. Because of Colby's sensory issues, we've never met anybody with Colby's severe sensory issues before. So we knew there was something going on besides just developmental delay. It was just that there were so many things coming at us at the same time that nobody could really point to one specific disability. We
Right.
knew it was, we had multiple disabilities going on. So in kindergarten, his kindergarten teacher saw a news story about autism and came back and said, you know, I know you don't want to hear this, but this is Colby. And she was right, I did not want to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I started looking more into it, and then about 6 months later, a first grade teacher came to me and said, I went to a workshop about sensory processing disorder, and I really think Colby has this. And I went to the workshop a few months later, and it was just like hearing a book about Colby being just described him completely, and I was stunned because we'd never heard of this before ever. The pediatrician had never heard of it. None of the therapists had ever heard of it. So I found an occupational therapist in Dallas who could assess him and his brother for it. And he was assessed for it and found that he did have severe sensory processing disorder. And she came back outside after evaluating him and said, has anybody ever told you he has Asperger's? And I started laughing and said, no. I mean, he hasn't been formally diagnosed, but you're the second person who has said, your son looks like he may be on the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So we went back to Arkansas and started actively trying to find someone that could tell us whether or not Colby was on the spectrum. And it was like finding a needle in a haystack.
Okay. So you did find somebody that could give you a diagnosis?
We, at that time, Colby was in first grade when we finally got him diagnosed with sensory processing disorder. And we'd heard about Dentist Development Center from the speech therapists. So we called them, and they had already looked at Colby once before, and when he was 4 years old. And they were very reluctant to diagnose him with autism.
Because
They said it was a death sentence. Those were their exact words. It's a death sentence.
yeah, but I mean, it is what it is. I mean, was there a reason? Was he
Because
too
of
young,
his age,
or was he
they
okay?
said, you know, because it was 4 at the time, they were hesitant to do it. They thought that developmental delay would work out better, but basically at that time, because the Affordable Care Act had not been passed, your insurance would not pay for anything. So if you got an autism diagnosis, you weren't going to get coverage for any type of therapy at all. You weren't going to get any assistance for medical care at all. So they really did not want to do that, and that's what they meant by a death sentence. They didn't literally mean your child's life is over. They meant your life as you know it, your financial life is over.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so when he was in first grade, we tried to go back in there again, and they stuck with the developmental delay diagnosis. And at third grade, I called them back and said, you're going to give us a definitive diagnosis. We have wasted so much time and so many years. We need a definitive diagnosis besides developmental delay. He's 9. Give us a diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
So we went in, and a team evaluated him and came back with Asperger's.
Okay. Okay, so you mentioned the teachers had asked if after seeing stuff on the news and going to workshops and things, if any of this sounded familiar, if it sounded like Colby to you. So did the school help push for Colby's diagnosis? I mean, are they really great about advocating for kids or for providing all the services that kids need?
No.
No?
No.
Who will
No,
advocate for these kids?
The parents. I mean, you are your child's best advocate. No one is going to advocate for your child like you are, because no one is invested in your child like you are. No one cares about your child's future like you do. And that's not to say that the teachers don't care. They do. But they don't have the time, they don't have the money, they don't have the resources to advocate for your child